The UK has a legally binding commitment to reach net zero under the Climate Change Act, but government policy alone won't be enough to meet it. Individuals and businesses are going to have to make greener choices too. Now, a recent report from the UK's Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology has outlined options and challenges in encouraging and enabling individuals in high emissions sectors to make greener choices. But can small-scale green choices really impact the wider issue of climate change? And are policy changes the most effective way at encouraging change, or is it more down to individual choices? Today we're breaking down that report to find out. Projections from the UK's Climate Change Committee, CCC, suggest that current and planned policies will be insufficient to meet the sixth carbon budget covering the period 2033 to 2037. Achieving this will require drastic action across multiple sectors, as there is a need to reach net zero by 2050. One solution to this is encouraging and enabling green choices. Now, thankfully, that doesn't mean laying out every single choice that you have to make throughout the day, because of an effect called spillover. Spillover means that principles can be taught in one place and apply to another. For instance, if something like turning the lights off to save energy is taught in one environment, say a school or workplace, then it's likely that those learnings will spill over into how people act at home too. Now, there are certain frameworks that people can follow to take advantage of this and encourage green change. One such framework is the upstream-downstream framework, with policy following 3 levels of change. Upstream is legislative change, midstream is sustainable options from small businesses, and downstream is informational measures to encourage individual decision-making. Another framework example would be the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework. Avoid, like moving to a vegetation diet to avoid meat. Shift, by carpooling or taking public transport instead of driving. And improve, like installing heat pumps instead of boilers. All of these are encouraged methods for individuals to help contribute in a good way to solving the climate crisis and, importantly, reaching net zero by 2050. And therefore, these are green choices. But now knowing what green choices are and what they might look like, what are the sectors which most desperately need them? And how can we best encourage green choices in these sectors? The government and the CCC have plans to deal with the 3 major sectors that contribute the most greenhouse gas emissions. Starting off with transport, this sector needs to cut its emissions by 90% in order to reach the 2050 target. One possible green choice to help with this is to adopt electric vehicles, and we're well on our way. EV sales made up 20% of car sales in the UK in August of 2023. Meanwhile, buildings are another sector, and they contributed 17% of the UK's emissions in 2019. Green choices that would reduce buildings emissions include installing heat pumps, double-glazed windows, and domestic energy generation such as rooftop solar panels. Finally, the consumption of goods and services in the UK creates roughly 27 million tonnes of waste every year, which contributes about 6% of the UK's emissions. Green choices that could help with that include recycling, food waste bins, and choosing low-carbon foods. Now, this all sounds great, but there is one problem that overhangs all of the sectors that we've talked about, and more. Misinformation. Misinformation is rife when it comes to climate change, but hopefully that can be fixed by increasing awareness of green choices, particularly as engagement strategies can emphasise the opportunities for citizens to contribute to net zero action and inform government policy effectiveness and acceptability. The way to do this on a governmental level is to identify trusted sources who can counter misinformation and convey positive and, most importantly, accurate information. For instance, if David Attenborough told you to turn your lights off as you leave the house, that's more likely to make a much more positive impression on the wider population than, say, if the message was delivered by a more controversial or polarising figure like Joe Rogan. Fundamentally, the aim of the game is to reach net zero by 2050, and one of the big ways of doing that is by highlighting the importance and also availability of green choices to the general population. However, those green choices aren't always the easiest choices to make, and to understand why, there is one looming question. What are the major issues with enabling green choices? Fundamentally, the biggest one is this: cost. For instance, issues with making transport green include the poor perception of public transport and the prohibitively high cost of electric vehicles. Issues with making buildings and housing green include the upfront retrofit costs, as well as a lack of skilled or trusted suppliers, something we've covered in the past regarding heat pumps in case you're interested. Plus, there's the fact that some buildings are inherently unsuitable to modern changes. All of these issues come back to cost. It is the major barrier for implementing green choices. Now, on this note, some may argue that green choices are a prerogative for the rich, as so many of them come with such high price tags. And digging further into that, the richest 10% of the population contribute around 50% of the emissions. And so, green choices certainly do have a bit of a class-based stigma around them. As well as this, house ownership is a barrier to controlling emissions, as renters in particular are often at the whim of their landlords and so lack control. Ultimately, a question which a lot of people might ask, particularly these days, is how can green choices be a priority when just living a normal life is so prohibitively expensive at the minute? The answer, of course, is that if we don't make an effort to control our greenhouse gas emissions, then it's game over for the planet. Or, at the very least, in the long run, it's going to be more expensive if we don't take action. Whilst it can seem frustrating and like there is little to no control over the big decisions, small individual decisions, as well as legislative support, can make a difference, at least in mindset and in real emissions, towards getting the UK to its net zero goal by 2050. And this is despite any flaws in legislation and implementation, and this is despite the prohibitive costs to some people. Green choices, big or small, are all positive efforts towards net zero. That's why it's so important to combat misinformation about climate change, so that we know which are the right green choices to make, so that individually we can all make a difference. Thanks for watching this episode of Science Fairs. If you enjoyed it, then the best way to support the channel is to leave a like on the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you know when the next video is out. We hope to see you in the next one.